28 years without a phone call, without a single card. I had grown used to that silence, used to it so deeply it felt like I had turned to stone. And then one November morning, while the newspaper still hadn't stopped calling me the woman who hit the $500 Powerball jackpot, a cream-colored envelope appeared on my kitchen table. The sender, Lauren, my daughter. Inside was an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. I stared at the handwriting, my hands trembling as if they didn't trust my eyes. Why now? After nearly 3 decades of silence, why would the daughter who once drove me out of her life suddenly want to see me? And more importantly, did I have the courage to open that decayed door to the past one more time? I set the cream envelope on the kitchen table beside my steaming coffee and studied it like some strange object falling from the sky. The embossed return address in the corner, that name, Lauren Whitaker Hartman, sliced straight into memory. 28 years of silence, 28 Thanksgivings gone by without a card, a call, or the faintest sign that my daughter still considered me part of her life. And then, right after the press started buzzing about the small-town Pennsylvania bookseller turned Powerball millionaire, this invitation showed up. People would call that a coincidence. To me it was a burning question mark. I brushed my fingertip across the thick, glossy paper, a kind of envelope I could never afford back when I lived on diner tips. I remembered the birthday cards I mailed Lauren and the Christmas postcards I sent Ethan and Maddie when they were little. Everyone returned, sealed and untouched. For all those years I learned to live with the void. Fill it with late shifts, second-hand novels, the smell of roasting coffee, and the chime of the bookstore door I built with my hands. And now, after a lifetime of silence, my daughter wanted me at her Thanksgiving table as if nothing had happened. I didn't rush to open it. I sat down, the wooden chair groaning under me, and sipped the bitter coffee. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and in that moment, my heart was pounding not from age or nerves but from an anger that had never really left. When I finally slit the envelope, inside was a card printed with a neat generic greeting. "We would love for you to join us this Thanksgiving." And just below, in the familiar scrawl I had once recognized on grade school homework, came the handwritten line, "It's been too long, Mom. Please come." I set the card down, leaned back and stared at the ceiling, asking myself, 28 years without a word, why now? Was it because they genuinely wanted to reconcile, or because of the $500 million everyone in town was whispering about? I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing. This invitation wasn't about a meal. It was the opening move in a reckoning I had waited my whole life for. I remember that night, etched into my mind like a mark that never fades. Lauren and Greg's new house stood in an affluent suburb outside Philadelphia, where white fences, garden lights, and perfectly trimmed lawns made it feel like the neighbors were competing in a quiet contest of prosperity. I arrived in a discount dress, carrying a homemade apple pie, while the other guests stepped out of gleaming luxury cars, arms full of imported wine and silver-wrapped gifts. Lauren greeted me at the door, a smile plastered on her lips but not reaching her eyes. I hugged her, feeling how fragile she'd become, and as my arms slipped around her, I noticed the bruise on her left wrist. She jerked slightly, tugging her sleeve down. "Just a little accident while unpacking boxes, Mom," she murmured, voice trembling, eyes darting away like a bird sensing danger. Greg appeared behind her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Evening, Nora," he said smoothly, his voice polite but sharp, before steering Lauren back toward their laughing guests. I watched her throughout the party. Lauren, the daughter who once argued with me about everything from books to politics, had grown strangely quiet. Every sentence out of her mouth began with "Greg thinks," or "Greg wants," as if her own thoughts had dissolved completely into his shadow. I couldn't stand it. When she slipped into the kitchen to grab another food tray, I followed. "Are you happy?" I asked, looking her square in the eye. She turned away, but the bruise was apparent beneath the fluorescent light when I gently took her hand. "That's not from moving boxes. Tell me the truth. Did Greg?" Lauren ripped her hand away as if burned. "Stop it, Mom. This is my party. Don't ruin it." I tried to steady my voice, but anger rose anyway. "Lauren, you're disappearing piece by piece. I can see it. This man doesn't love you. He controls you." Her eyes flashed with rage. "You don't know anything. Greg gave me everything you never could. A home, respect, a future. And what did you ever give me? Years of embarrassment watching you serve food at a diner, wishing you had enough to buy me what I needed. You always dragged me down. The words cut deep, but I whispered, "Love isn't a chain, sweetheart. I gave everything so you could stand here today. Don't let him break you." And that was when she exploded. "Get out, Mom. Right now. You only make me ashamed." I froze, hearing jazz music drifting from the living room, the scent of wine and perfume pressing down like a weight. Slowly I set down the tray, turned and walked out. Outside, the rain poured, cold as needles, soaking my cheap dress until it clung to me. I stood by the curb waiting for a taxi, not knowing if anyone inside even remembered I'd been there. All I had left was the fragile hope that tomorrow Lauren would call, that she'd understand I only wanted to protect her. But the next day came without a ring. And for the next 28 years that call never came. 28 years, and I can recount every empty slice of time, as clearly as the lines etched across my hands. At first, I clung to hope with handwritten letters on pale yellow paper, written in blue ink, telling Lauren about my shifts at work, the books I was reading, the way the maple tree outside my window blazed red and gold each autumn. I tucked in cheap but carefully chosen birthday cards and small gifts for Ethan and Maddie when they were little. A stuffed bear, a picture book, a scarf I knitted during lonely night shifts. Everyone returned sealed exactly as I had sent them, stamped with that cold red line, "Return to sender." I kept each envelope as proof of a one-sided conversation I refused to give up. At Christmas, I hung a pair of tiny stockings in my cramped apartment, a reminder that 2 grandchildren shared my blood somewhere. But on the morning of December 25th, it was only me, my shadow, and the smell of fresh coffee. I sometimes drove past their house, peeking through the fence from a distance, catching glimpses of light in the windows, hearing laughter spilling out, and each time I had to turn away before anyone noticed my stare. I told myself that next year would be different. But next year never came. Then came Ethan's high school graduation. I saw the local paper announcement and knew it would be held at the suburban school stadium. I drove out, parked at the far edge of the lot, and sat on the highest bleacher in the stands. I spotted him in his blue gown, walking across the stage to take his diploma. My grandson, carrying the Hartman name, had his father's height and Lauren's familiar head tilt from when she was young. I wanted to shout his name, to run down and hug him just once, but instead I gripped the plastic seat so tightly my knuckles turned white. After the ceremony, I watched from 100 yards away as they posed for family pictures beneath the congratulatory banner. I stood there like a ghost, staring into the life I once belonged to. Year after year, season after season, the silence stopped being a shock and became a rhythm. Wounds repeated long enough turn into scars, and so did my heart. I learned to move through my days without waiting, as if Lauren and the children were characters in a book I had dropped long ago and would never pick up again. And yet, on nights too quiet, when the wind hissed against my window, I couldn't help but wonder, did they ever think of me, even for the briefest moment? Or had the name Nora Whitaker been erased from the story of their lives? I once thought I would die alone, and that nearly became true the year I turned 57. It was a Tuesday morning like any other at the diner where I worked the early shift, and I had just poured another cup of coffee for a regular when my chest tightened as if a rope had been pulled around it. I collapsed onto the floor, hearing silverware clatter around me, and when I opened my eyes again I was in the ER, hooked up to wires and machines that beeped steadily. The doctor told me it wasn't the most severe kind of heart attack, but it was enough to warn me that next time I might not be so lucky. I spent 3 days in the hospital, with no one by my side except a coworker who stopped in briefly. Looking across the other beds, I saw patients surrounded by family, hands being held, soft laughter filling the rooms, while I had nothing but the low murmur of a television and the harsh white light above me. In that loneliness, I realized I had been waiting far too long, waiting for a phone call that would never come, for a door that would never open. I could either go on living like a shadow or decide that the rest of my life belonged to me. So when I was discharged, I enrolled in a business management program at the local community college. I worked weekend shifts at the diner, and during the week I went to class sitting beside kids the same age as my grandchildren, fumbling with a laptop, online assignments, and subjects that made my brain ache but also made me feel alive. Every AI I earned was like a new stitch pulling together an old, torn heart. I started saving, opening a small account I jokingly called my someday fund, for a dream my daughter once mocked. A little bookstore where people could read, drink coffee, and talk. After 4 years of scraping and saving, plus a modest loan from a local bank, I signed the lease on a worn corner space, cleaned it out, filled it with shelves bought at garage sales, and let the scent of roasting coffee blend with the smell of old paper. On opening day, only a handful of friends and a few curious strangers walked through the door, but it felt like being reborn to me. I was no longer the abandoned mother, no longer the waitress collapsed on a tiled floor. I was Nora Whitaker, owner of a book cafe where every story could rescue a heavy day. I learned to laugh without pretending, to talk to customers like they were a true community. I found myself again, not in the slammed doors of the past, but in the present, where I chose to open a new one. And just when I thought I had finally found peace, that cream-colored envelope appeared on my kitchen table, dragging me back into the dark pit of a relationship that had decayed long ago. I arrived on the street, written on the invitation, earlier than planned, sitting in my car for a few minutes to study the house Lauren had now called home. It was a far cry from the grand white mansion where I had once been pushed out nearly 3 decades ago. This was a modest 2-story place, its pale gray paint peeling in spots, the front lawn patchy with brown and green, and a crooked basketball hoop leaning near the curb. No manicured rose bushes or luxury cars were in the driveway. Only an old SUV and a standard sedan. Suppose I hadn't read the address myself. In that case, I might not have believed this was where Lauren, the daughter who once lived beneath the glow of cocktail parties and lavish vacations, now resided like any other middle-class family in Pennsylvania. I walked up the steps and rang the bell. The door opened not to Lauren, but to a tall young man with neatly cut brown hair and a face that carried Greg's features but Lauren's eyes. Ethan. I had followed his life from a distance, knew he'd gone to college in New York, and worked at a financial firm before disappearing from the family updates. He studied me for a few seconds, his look polite but cold as ice, then spoke. "Grandma." The word came out stiff, unnatural, like a title he had never practiced using. I smiled, nodded in greeting, but felt the weight of the 22 empty years between us. Ethan stepped aside, courteous like a receptionist, nothing more. Inside the living room, a young woman sat cross-legged in a chair, a laptop open with colorful sketches glowing on the screen, headphones dangling around her neck. Her hair was split into 2 clashing shades, green in the front and black in the back, her gaze sharp and tinged with defiance. Maddie, 20 years old, an unapologetic artist, nothing like the proper image Lauren must have wished for. She looked at me as if studying a subject in an exhibit, her wide eyes showing no attempt to hide her curiosity. "So this is Grandma," she said, half mocking and intrigued. I found nothing better to answer than, "Nice to meet you." She shrugged, snapped her laptop shut, and stood to shake my hand, a grip firmer than I expected, her fingertips smudged with ink. The house felt foreign to me, not only because of its modest walls but because of the energy inside. Gone was the bright, forced shine of high society I once saw at the mansion years ago. Instead, there was a jumble of frayed air, the smell of cheap cleaner mixing with leftover pizza. On a shelf stood a family photo in a frame cracked with a diagonal line, like the fractured relationships inside this home. As I stepped further in, I realized I was no casual visitor but an unwilling player on a stage, where every glance, Ethan's stiff courtesy and Maddie's sharp, provocative curiosity, was testing me. I had not yet seen Lauren, but I knew the real confrontation would only begin when she walked into the room. I sat down at the Thanksgiving table like someone who had wandered onto a stage where all the parts had been cast long before my arrival. On the checkered tablecloth sat a medium-sized turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce in a plastic dish, food so ordinary it reminded me of the years when I could only afford simple dinners, except here the simplicity carried no warmth, only an awkward sense of rehearsal. Lauren sat across from me, wearing a stiffly pleasant expression, her face carefully made up, but her lips trembling slightly each time she smiled. Greg took the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, his eyes sweeping quietly over us like a reminder that control still belonged to him. Sitting to my left, Ethan was the first to speak, his tone far too formal for a family meal. "Grandma, I heard you've continued running the bookstore even with your new circumstances. How do you manage operating costs and maximize profit in that industry?" I glanced at him, hearing the hesitation in his choice of words. It wasn't genuine curiosity, but a financially sounding question wrapped around something else, a probe. Before I could answer, Maddie laughed sharply, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, please, Ethan, she's not one of your investment clients. Let her breathe. Are we turning Thanksgiving dinner into a financial interview now? Lauren frowned, trying to smooth things over. Maddie, that's enough. Mom just wants everyone to feel comfortable. But how she stressed the word mom only made the air heavier, like a flimsy mask stretched over 20 years of silence. Greg said nothing, just sliced turkey with deliberate motions, his eyes flicking toward me as he laid a portion onto a plate. I knew that look, it was the same from the rainy night long ago, when I saw the bruise on Lauren's wrist and Greg's hand clamped down on her shoulder like a lock. Ethan tried again, his voice more careful. I just mean you've achieved something most business owners never do. They could have a big impact if you have plans. I set my fork down, anger quietly stirring in my veins, but Maddie jumped in first, her eyes flashing sharp as blades. A big impact, or why don't you just say it, Ethan? Everyone here wants to know what she will do with $500 million. Grandma doesn't need to hear your polite little riddles. Lauren quickly interjected, her pitch rising half a note, trying to cover the moment. No, Maddie, we're not talking about money tonight. Tonight is about family. But I could see it, their eyes all turned toward me, even Lauren's behind her strained smile. Ethan waited for an investment lecture. Greg tapped his fingers on the table, impatient like a man demanding a debt repaid. Maddie folded her arms, watching how I reacted to the false performance. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch, the clock tick striking like a blade against the quiet. And then I understood with cold clarity. No one had invited me here out of genuine longing for reunion. This dinner was a binding act. A staged show where my role was to be the mother who had suddenly become a gold mine. They were waiting for me to speak first, to suggest checks, investments, the distribution of wealth I had never promised. The words Happy Thanksgiving had already been spoken, but they rang hollow, like the thud of an empty drum in a room starved of sincerity. I cut a small piece of turkey, tasted its dryness on my tongue, and knew the real battle had just begun. Lauren hurriedly stood up and grabbed my arm as the dinner settled into a suffocating silence. Mom, come into the kitchen with me for a moment. I need help with dessert, she said, her voice forced into calmness while her cold, clammy hand betrayed the tension she was trying to hide. I let her pull me into the small kitchen where the fluorescent light glared against a scratched wooden counter, where the sink was piled with dirty dishes, and store-bought pies sat unopened in their cartons. Lauren stood with her back to me for a few seconds, taking a deep breath as if bracing herself, then turned, her eyes trying to project a gentleness that didn't belong to her. Mom, I think maybe we should start over, she said, trembling slightly beneath a strained smile. I looked at my daughter, and on her face I saw not just the marks of age but the cracks of self-deception. Start over as mother and daughter, I asked slowly, or start over as a transaction? The words slipped out sharp as a blade. Lauren froze, her smile vanishing, her eyes darting down to the floor where a streak of turkey gravy had dripped. She said nothing, her body shrinking slightly as if caught in a lie, and I could see the war in her eyes, between the pull of blood and the desperation of clinging to money that might salvage the family's reputation. I stepped closer, not letting my gaze leave the face that had once been my whole world. 28 years, Lauren. 28 years of letters, gifts, knocking on the door of your heart, and all I got was silence. You didn't come when Ethan graduated, when Maddie had birthdays, not even when I was in the hospital after my heart scare. And now, when the papers run stories about a Powerball ticket, suddenly you want to talk about starting over. My voice wasn't loud, but each word fell like stone. Lauren swallowed hard, lips pressed tight. I saw her lashes quiver and wanted to speak, but she could not form the words. Do you think I don't see it? I went on. You want to fix something, your family's name with the neighbors, the law, and Greg? Or do you truly want your mother back? This time Lauren looked up, a flicker of defiance flashing before she quickly looked away, dodging the truth. In the silence I heard the clock ticking on the wall, Maddie's mocking laugh floating from the living room, the clatter of silverware reminding me this wasn't some sweet kitchen chat between mother and daughter but a duel. Lauren reached for the pie box, pretending to be busy herself, slicing it to avoid an answer. I moved closer, lowered my voice but didn't relent. Silence is an answer too, Lauren. You don't have to say it. Your eyes already have. And in that moment I caught a flicker in her gaze, not the light of maternal love, but the fear of losing a final chance. She set the knife down hard, her hand trembling. Mom, I don't know where to start, she admitted, her voice breaking. I looked at my daughter and saw weakness and calculation layered together like two drinks that would never blend. And I knew no truth had been spoken tonight. Only another act playing out behind a messy backstage. And I, the mother long abandoned, now stood in this cramped kitchen, torn between wanting to hold the child who had once been flesh of my flesh and wanting to cut the cord that had bound me to pain for nearly 3 decades. I walked back into the dining room with steady steps but a clarity inside me, as if I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Every eye turned toward me at once. Greg sat with his arms crossed, his expression one of feigned patience though a vein throbbed at his temple. Ethan forced a polite smile, clutching his wineglass as if it were a shield. Maddie leaned back in her chair, her eyes lit with expectant fire, and Lauren dabbed quickly at her eyes, her face tight as though she'd just been exposed under a harsh spotlight. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and placed a brown leather portfolio on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood cut the room into silence. I opened it, drew out neatly stacked folders, and spoke calmly but sharply enough to tear through the pretense cloaking the room. I want you all to hear this once and for all. I have established 3 trusts. First, an education trust for the next generation. If Ethan or Maddie ever have children, their college tuition and living expenses will be guaranteed, regardless of their parents' financial situation. Second, an arts trust for mid-career artists, people like Maddie and others in the creative world, who can apply for grants when the market turns its back on them. Third, a housing trust should be established for older laborers, men and women who spent their lives working with their hands, to have a stable home in their later years. An independent board oversees all 3. No one in this family has the authority to touch them. Greg shifted in his seat, sitting upright, his face flushed red. I knew he was calculating the collapse of the hopes he'd been quietly feeding. Ethan blinked rapidly, his face frozen, unable to catch up with the numbers. Lauren pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling through her fingers, her composure gone. But I wasn't finished. I reached back into the portfolio and pulled out something heavier, placing it firmly in the center of the table. A thick album, its spine worn, its pages preserved with the stubbornness of a mother who refused to forget. I slid it toward Lauren, my voice rough but steady. 28 years. Every letter, every Christmas card, every birthday gift that came back to me, I kept them. All of them are here. I opened it, showing the envelope stamped "Return to Sender," the photographs taken from a distance. Lauren holding Ethan on his first day of school, Maddie in her high school dance dress, the holidays where I stood outside the fence, hidden in the dark. The air cracked with silence that felt louder than any explosion. Greg's face burned crimson, his fists clenched tight as though ready to shatter something. Ethan lowered his head, lips moving as if to speak, but no words came, his eyes locked on the snapshots of maternal devotion captured in secret. Lauren broke into sobs, years of dammed-up grief bursting at once, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. And Maddie, the granddaughter I had never once held, sat up straighter, her wide eyes stripped of sarcasm, filled instead with curiosity and something close to awe, as if, for the first time, she saw me not as an older woman, but as a witness who had carried love unbroken through time. I looked around the table, feeling each gaze like a shard of truth cutting through. And I knew that this moment, not the money, not the charities, was the real spark that would ignite the years buried in silence. This wasn't a plea for reconciliation, nor a weapon of revenge, but the truth laid bare on a Thanksgiving table, raw, unadorned, undeniable. And I, Nora Whitaker, had finally forced them all to look at what they had turned away from for nearly 3 decades. Greg was the first to break the crushing silence, his hand slamming against the table so hard the wineglass rattled violently. "This is outrageous, Nora," he snarled, his face blazing red with fury. "You dare dump this pile of trash on my table to disgrace my family in my house on Thanksgiving?" I met his glare without flinching. The angrier he grew, the clearer his fear became, the fear eating him alive. Lauren collapsed into sobs, burying her face in her hands. "You only came back to punish me, didn't you? After all these years, you just want to hurt me again." Her voice cracked, tears spilling across the tablecloth stained with cranberry and wine. Ethan stared at the album, his expression torn. Caught between sides he didn't know how to choose. Maddie folded her, silent, but her eyes fixed on me with a peculiar intensity. I drew a long breath, steadying my voice to the calm rhythm of a heart tempered by storms. "No," I said. "I didn't come to punish you, Lauren. I came to the end of it. To end 28 years of being misunderstood, ignored, and erased. If all you see in this is vengeance, then so be it. But the truth is, I knocked far too many times and no one answered. I don't need an answer anymore." I closed the portfolio, pushed it to the center of the table like a final verdict, and looked straight at my daughter. "I've done my part. Now the choice is yours." In that moment, Thanksgiving dinner ceased to be a meal. It became a shattered battlefield where we stood exposed amid the shards of memory we had long pretended weren't there. As I rose to leave, Lauren still had her face buried in her hands, while Greg turned away, his gaze hard and locked as if he could seal the entire room in silence. Ethan sat motionless, his eyes staring blankly at the half-open album. Only Maddie stood, quietly moving ahead, then gently pulling open the front door for me to step outside. The cold wind swept through the hallway, carrying the fading scent of turkey. On the porch, Maddie stood beside me, her hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie, her voice low and clipped. "The Arts Trust, you meant that?" I met her eyes, and in them I saw no trace of the usual sarcasm, only a bright, hungry light tempered by caution. I pulled a small card from my bag and handed it to her. "Information's on the back, blind review. No one will know you're my granddaughter. The board looks only at the work, not the name." Maddie took it, offering a faint, lopsided smile, the shrug meant to look indifferent, though her eyes betrayed the excitement beneath. "Sounds fair," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I let my hand rest briefly on her shoulder before pulling away, unwilling to let the moment of closeness stretch into awkwardness. Maddie studied me for another few seconds, as if on the verge of saying something more, but in the end only nodded, her eyes glowing beneath the porch light. A silent promise had passed between us, needing no further words. I stepped down the stairs, heard the door close softly behind me, and knew that amid the ashes of a shattered dinner, at least one new flame had just been lit. I had just stepped past the gate, the cold wind lashing against my face like thin whips, when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Mom!" Lauren's voice cracked in the night, trembling like a taut string. I turned and saw her standing on the sidewalk, her carefully styled hair now a mess, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "We're family," she blurted out, more a declaration than a plea. I looked at my daughter, the woman who had cast me out nearly 3 decades ago, and now she wielded a word she herself had hollowed out to try to hold me back. I drew in a breath, my voice calm, almost cold. "We share DNA, Lauren. But family requires responsibility. It's not just a label. Not something to pull out when it's convenient and toss aside when it gets in the way." I saw her lips quiver, as if searching for a rebuttal, but none came. She had grown too accustomed to defining family as a shield, never learning how to carry the weight of the wounds she had left behind. I pulled my coat tighter around me and turned away. My footsteps rang sharp against the stone sidewalk, each strike of my heels folding into the cutting night wind. I didn't look back or wait for another excuse or a belated call that would never come. For 28 years I had waited, and the silence itself had taught me that some apologies will never arrive, and some doors, once closed, exist only as memory. This time I walked into the cold night carrying no expectation, only the quiet relief of someone who had finally set down a burden far too long held. I rearranged the shelves when an employee brought in a bouquet of white lilies, with a small card tucked inside. "Please give me a chance. Old Café on Main tomorrow afternoon. Lauren." I stood frozen for a long moment, the lily's heavy scent pulling at memories, before finally nodding, not out of expectation, but out of the need to close a chapter. The next afternoon, I walked into the little cafe where Lauren and I used to go when she was still in college. The place was almost unchanged. Worn wooden tables, the smell of espresso thick in the air, condensation blurring the glass windows. Lauren was already seated in the corner, her makeup softer than usual, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. When I pulled out a chair, she hesitated, then spoke in a low but steady voice. "Yes, I wrote the letter because of money, but not just for money. I was afraid of losing you." I didn't answer right away, only watched her. The pride she had clung to for so long had cracked in her eyes, leaving her ashamed. She went on, her voice trembling like a thin blade. When the news broke, I thought if I didn't do something, I would lose you forever, lose any chance to fix this. I know I've been selfish. I know I left you outside for 28 years. She brushed her tears quickly with the back of her hand, then gave a bitter laugh. Do you remember when I was 8 in the hospital with pneumonia? You read The Secret Garden to me 3 nights in a row. You even did the voices for Mary and Colin, made me laugh so hard I started coughing. Her voice cracked. I remember thinking then that as long as I had you, I didn't have to be afraid of anything. I watched the tears stream down her cheeks, falling into the cold coffee before her. Suddenly, the image of that little girl with a raspy throat, her eyes glowing as I turned each page, came flooding back, shattering the ice I had built around my heart. I placed my hand flat on the table, not touching hers but close enough to warm the space between us. I remember, I whispered. I never forgot. In that moment my anger retreated, replaced by a deep ache and a faint glimmer of light. Lauren bent her head into her hands and sobbed openly, while I sat still, listening to the clink of spoons against cups, the strains of old jazz swirling like echoes of a past that had never truly died. I said nothing about forgiveness, nothing about forgetting, but I knew that on that cold afternoon, a small door had opened where at last, for the first time in decades, we could see each other across the long shadow we had carried. I stepped onto the porch that Christmas afternoon, the air sharp and biting, but through the window spilled the glow of warm yellow light and the faint strains of carols. There was no sign of Greg's car in the driveway, which eased my chest's tightness. When the door opened, it was only Lauren, Ethan and Maddie, 3 faces, 3 different shades of expression. Lauren forcing a smile, her eyes still hesitant. Ethan giving a polite nod, his cheeks flushed as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Maddie leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, her gaze mischievous but stripped of its old chill. The meal on the wooden table was simple. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, greens, and apple pie. No expensive wine, no lavish spread like the ones I once remembered. Just a plain family dinner. Honest in its modesty, softened something inside me. When it came time for gifts, I reached into the bag I'd brought. For Ethan, I handed over a rare economics book I had tracked down, an old edition by a scholar his grandfather had once admired. He took it, eyes widening before bowing his head to whisper a husky thank you. For Maddie, I offered a set of imported paints. Her hands trembled as she touched them, then she let out a crooked little smile, her eyes glowing as if she were staring at a genuine possibility. Blind review, remember? I reminded, and she nodded, clutching the paints as if they were treasure. Finally, I placed before Lauren a leather-bound notebook filled with the recipes of her childhood. The way I used to make chicken soup when she was sick, the almond cookies I baked every Christmas. She opened it, her fingers trembling as they skimmed across my handwritten pages, then looked up, her eyes wet but lit with something more profound than regret. I have something for you too, she said, pulling from beneath the table a new photo album with a blue cover, placing it carefully in my hands. I opened it and saw not the past but the present. Ethan at his graduation, Maddie in a paint-splattered studio, Lauren at a small desk, her hair tied back, a cold cup of coffee beside her. You deserve to know who we are now, Lauren said softly, her voice cracked but clear. I closed the album, my hands trembling slightly, and in that moment, I no longer felt the span of 28 years, only the presence of 3 faces before me, 3 lives, and the fragile hope that perhaps there was still room for me in the chapters yet to be written. In the small kitchen, the sound of running water and the scent of soap filled the air. I stood beside Lauren, the 2 of us washing dishes as if we had done it our whole lives, though it was the first time in nearly 3 decades. Lauren kept her head down, carefully rinsing each plate, her voice so soft only I could hear. I'll handle Greg on my own. I'm not asking you to save me anymore. I set a clean glass onto the towel, lifting my gaze to her reflection blurred in the window pane. Good, I said, my tone firm but not heavy. Because I won't save you. But I will listen. Lauren looked up, her eyes wet yet steadier than before. In that moment, I knew we were no longer enemies on opposite shores but 2 women learning to draw boundaries while opening a narrow path toward one another. Maddie quietly followed me to the porch when I slipped on my coat to leave. The cold wind stung my face, our breaths turning into pale clouds in the night air. She pulled a slim envelope from her hoodie pocket and handed it to me, the familiar half-smile on her lips, but with a brightness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "My first exhibition, if you want to come." I took it, brushing the paper still warm from her hand, and gave a slight nod. As I stepped down the porch, the snow crunched beneath my shoes, the white road stretching ahead like a blank page. I thought of the 28 years lost, the hollow days no one could return. But as I tightened my grip on the invitation, I understood that perhaps, at the very least, there was still a small road leading forward, one where I would no longer walk alone. Some wounds may look like scars, but when an old envelope surfaces, we realize they never truly healed. My story, the story of Nora Whitaker, is not just the tragedy of an abandoned mother or the cruel rejection of a daughter. It is a long journey of rediscovering myself through loss, of choosing to live for my own sake after years of merely existing for others. I once believed family was an unbreakable bond, until I learned that family is not just blood, but responsibility, presence, and the willingness to listen. Money can bring people closer, but only truth allows us to sit at the same table. 28 years have passed, and no one can return them. But if we dare to move forward, sometimes we can still find a narrow path ahead. I want to leave you with this message. Don't let someone else's silence or rejection define your worth. Hold fast to love, but also learn to draw boundaries and live fully for yourself. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't about freeing the other person. It's about allowing yourself to walk forward with a lighter heart. And you, after hearing this story, what do you think about love, forgiveness, and the boundaries we draw in family? Share your thoughts below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, so you can join me in exploring more journeys filled with emotion. Because who knows, one story might shine a light into someone's darkness.